We're going to bring in Aaron Maté right now. Is Aaron with us? So I'm going to introduce Aaron. I think most people watching know who he is. He's really was and has been in the forefront of the journalists debunking the Russiagate story very early on, with our founder, Robert Parry, and other writers at Consortium News, including your host here. We all withstood vicious and absurd attacks that we were Trump supporters or Kremlin agents, really new Cold War stuff, right? When we were, I think, speaking for myself anyway, and for Bob, really nonpartisan. We saw through this phony collusion story from the start. And perhaps we saw that the abuse of power by intelligence agencies was a greater long-term threat to the U.S. than maybe even 4 years of Donald Trump. So welcome, Aaron, for joining us on the premiere edition of CN Live. Really appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to talk to you about the article that you published in Real Clear Investigations. Quite interesting. But first, today, as you know, there was news that Robert Mueller, special counsel, will not be testifying on July 17th. Well, the way I saw it was it's indefinitely suspended. Why do you think that Mueller might be relieved that he doesn't have to testify?
Well, it's interesting. We can only speculate, right? But I think we have to note, first of all, that Robert Mueller made very clear he did not want to testify. And I think the reasons for that are obvious. He wrote a disingenuous report that, basically looked at every single instance where somebody in the Trump orbit interacted with somebody with a Russian passport or who claims to know somebody who has a Russian passport. And he spun that in the most damning way possible, while ultimately having to acknowledge that there was no conspiracy there and there never was one, as Bob Parry was flagging from the very beginning. And then his press conference was disingenuous for many reasons. He tried to suggest he would have charged Trump otherwise without saying he would. And then, of course, he had to backtrack on that when Barr made him issue a joint statement clarifying his remarks. And so basically, Mueller has been disingenuous, and we know that his report left out all the questionable things. It didn't look really at the role of the Steele dossier. It suggested that people were Russian agents without accusing them of being Russian agents, while leaving out countervailing information, like in the case of Konstantin Kilimnik, Manafort's business associate, that Kilimnik actually was a valued State Department informant. So, Mueller understandably did not want to face scrutiny for all these things. That's why I think he didn't want to come testify. And they had to subpoena him to get him to come appear. And so as to why now they've had to delay it for a week again, I mean, the official story is that they want Mueller to appear for longer, but they're working out the details. It's a bit murky, but I mean, my speculation here is simply that Mueller is either trying to buy time to prepare for the inevitable questioning he'll face from the Republican members, or he's just trying to stall and buy more time in an effort to see if he can avoid testifying entirely. It's certainly going to be an interesting couple of weeks.
Yeah, for sure. Now, I bet like hell that he was trying to prove collusion, unless he never really believed it himself. I don't know, obviously, but he just couldn't. So he's not let go of the idea. He floated the obstruction of justice idea, which is not taking hold either. But he's never really let go of this idea that Russia massively interfered in the election with the hack of the DNC and Podesta emails and these $100,000 in Facebook ads from a private Russian clickbait farm. So in your article, you go through some of this. Could you take us through exactly why you believe Mueller has a flimsy case for the Russian side, the thing that he seemed most certain of?
Well, the flimsiness and the disingenuousness of Mueller's case was just really exposed over the past few weeks when it comes to what Mueller calls the second part of Russia's sweeping and systemic interference. So he says that Russia's interference occurred principally through two operations. And the first one he identifies is a social media campaign by this firm, the IRA, the Internet Research Agency, to sow discord. That's what Mueller says was the aim was. And, and he says that this is part of a Russian active measures campaign and all this stuff. And the suggestion that he strongly leaves us with, starting with his initial indictment of this Russian firm in February 2018, through his report with language like that this was a part of a Russian government interference operation, was that this troll farm was acting on behalf of the Russian government. I mean, that's been the widespread assumption. That's the characterization widely repeated across media. I mean, that's what. But if you look at Mueller's report closely, and this is what I point out in the article I did, Mueller never actually says that this troll farm was working with the Russian government or was acting on the Russian government's behalf. He asserts in one section that this troll farm was a part of a Russian interference operation, which was carried out by the Russian government, because he also accuses the Russian government of hacking the emails. But then when it gets down to actually describing the troll farm's actions, he never says that it works with the Russian government. And that is because it's a private Russian clickbait firm putting out, by the way, juvenile ads that mostly have nothing to do with the election. So even if this were like coming right from the Kremlin, the notion that this was an election interference operation is a joke, because this was juvenile clickbait ads. And Bob Perry, if I remember right, was pointing out what a farce this was from the beginning, about how all these ads were mostly unrelated to the election. And most of them, by the way, aired after the election. So it's disingenuous in itself to claim that this was an election interference effort when it's clickbait trash on social media. It's even more disingenuous now that Robert Mueller, and this is the latest news from the past few weeks, has had to admit in court that the Russian government had nothing to do with that clickbait. So that right there, if that is the first of two principal operations, Mueller says, of Russian interference, but Mueller has to acknowledge it has nothing to do with the Russian government, then the obvious question is, what else is Mueller being disingenuous about? And how strong of a case does he have for a sweeping and systematic Russian interference campaign if the first one has just collapsed? And then you look at the details for the second aspect, which is the hacking and leaking of Democratic Party emails. And that's where it's a bit more complicated. There's what I try to point out in my piece is a few things. One, when he gets down to describing the actual operation where he wants us to believe Russian GRU officers stole the emails, he throws in a qualified word. He says during the sessions, GRU officers, quote, appear to have stolen thousands of emails, which to me raises a red flag, because if in his initial indictment he said the Russian government officers stole the emails, why then, nearly a year later in his report, is he now saying they appear to have stolen the emails? That says to me that is a legalistic way to cover up for the fact that he actually doesn't know for sure that Russian government officers stole the emails. And there are many other things. His timeline when it comes to Guccifer 2.0, this alleged Russian intelligence cutout who supplied the emails to WikiLeaks, is really off base. According to Mueller's narrative, Assange would have announced that he had Assange would have had to have announced the pending publication of these stolen Democratic Party emails, which he did on June 12th, before he communicated with his Russian government source and got the documents from his Russian government source, because Mueller contends that Assange got this stuff from the Russian government and that the cutout they used was Guccifer 2.0. So that just doesn't make sense on its face that Assange would do that, which brings us to another glaring hole, which is that Mueller didn't speak to Assange, which is just a very puzzling investigative decision. If you're investigating a theft of emails, you want to speak to the person who received that theft and who published it. And there are many more examples like that call into question Mueller's case here. But I think that's a good place to start.
Elizabeth, before I bring you in, I wanted to ask Aaron one more question about the. He says that there were texts, and he gives the file names in the report, that these were the texts that Guccifer 2.0 and DC Leaks sent to Assange. And then he mentions there were intermediaries that transferred the files. I mean, which one is it? And why would Assange even know? If this were a Russian intelligence operation, it would be, I guess, on a need-to-know basis. They wouldn't told Assange. So he's accusing him of lying in the report, that Assange is lying about it not being Russia. How would Assange even have known that? He could have gotten, if he got it from an intermediary in particular.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But my focus here is whether or not Mueller has proved that Assange even got the emails from a Russian government source. And by the way, I'm sorry, I missed out the biggest part. Mueller explicitly acknowledges that he has no idea how Assange got the emails. So what he did in his indictment of the GRU officers for allegedly stealing the emails in July 2018, and later on in his report, he suggests, he doesn't outright say actually, but he suggests strongly, and he wants us to believe that Assange got the emails when Guccifer 2.0 transferred them to him, because Mueller includes in his timeline that Guccifer 2.0 transferred a large file to WikiLeaks in July. And then soon after that, WikiLeaks published the email. So Mueller wants us to think, without outright stating, because he can't outright state it because he doesn't actually have proof that it's true, that Guccifer 2.0 transferred the emails to Assange. But then in the report, Mueller drops something new. He says the office cannot rule out that the stolen emails were transferred to WikiLeaks physically in the summer of 2016, which tells us that Mueller has no idea how those emails made their way to WikiLeaks, which is all the more interesting because otherwise Mueller claims to have this really invasive window into Russian intelligence. So invasive that he can tell us, you know, what searches they made and what keystrokes they did, you know, but yet he, all of a sudden, when it gets to telling us how they made their way to WikiLeaks, all of a sudden he has no clue. And that is I think a huge red flag when it comes to, you know, trusting Mueller in his trying to prove to us that he knows how this email theft was committed.
Elizabeth.
Absolutely. No, I thought it was a fascinating point you made multiple times in your article, that there's this profound lack of curiosity from Mueller when it comes to Assange and WikiLeaks and actually investigating that part of this major issue. So I don't want to ask you to speculate too much, but I wonder if you have an opinion on whether you know, that profound lack of curiosity when it comes to Assange and WikiLeaks, and also with, you know, getting the access to the DNC servers directly rather than just allowing, you know, the CrowdStrike's redacted draft to suffice. Do you think that that was more about protecting the narrative of Russiagate, or was that just some sort of oversight, if you would like to comment?
Yeah, well, look, okay, so take how Mueller approached the collusion angle, for example, because when it comes to that, there is a profound commitment to protecting the FBI's narrative. And it's not surprising. Mueller is the former director of the FBI. This is what he comes from. So the idea that Mueller would have come in and done this independent review and just gone for the facts is, you know, is really unlikely. And his work product shows that, because on all these key things, he is not applying sufficient scrutiny to the FBI's decisions. And he's sort of lending credence to the FBI's narrative by simply ignoring countervailing facts. So, you know, I mentioned Konstantin Kilimnik before. Kilimnik is, the FBI says that Kilimnik has ties to Russian intelligence. And the reason why he's important is because he's a business associate of Paul Manafort. And for a while, it was a big part of the conspiracy theory that because Manafort allegedly shared polling data with Kilimnik, and because Kilimnik allegedly has ties to the GRU, that meant that Manafort shared this polling data with Kilimnik. Kilimnik then passed that to the Russian government, and the Russian government used that for their sophisticated targeting of American states. And that's why Donald Trump won, because these Russian social media ads were so brilliant and so sophisticated that they swayed American voters using possibly the polling data that Manafort passed on to Kilimnik, right? So Mueller mentions that Kilimnik FBI has ties to Russian intelligence, which on its face, like, what does that mean? He has ties to the GRU. Does that mean he's an agent? Does that mean he just spoke to somebody who's a GRU agent? What does it mean? It's like, it's a vague term to imply something sinister without having to actually make a direct claim on Mueller's part. So Mueller includes that in his report, and he then lists all these reasons about why it's quite plausible that Kilimnik has GRU ties. He omits the fact that Kilimnik was literally a State Department informant. And, you know, that was known, some details of that were known, but we recently learned more details from John Solomon in The Hill. And I believe Consortium News covered this too, you know, but he omits the fact completely that, like, Kilimnik was providing valuable intelligence to the State Department when Kilimnik was working in Ukraine with Manafort, where, by the way, Kilimnik was helping Manafort pursue, trying to push Ukraine away from Russia, which is another aspect that is completely ignored because, you know, there's a need here. There's an imperative here to prove a conspiracy theory, and those inconvenient facts don't jive with that. So that's just one example of Mueller being disingenuous to justify the collusion speculation when really the collusion speculation was baseless to begin with. And so, is it fair to speculate that Mueller took the exact same approach when it comes to the Russian government interference operation? Yeah, and look at the fact that he tried to strongly suggest that the Russian government interference operation included a troll farm that he knew full well had nothing to do with the Russian government. So I think the idea that Mueller embellished the facts, Mueller took certain things, ignored others, didn't, the fact he didn't interview Julian Assange, I think it's all fair to conclude that Mueller was not interested in finding out the actual truth.
Absolutely.
Well,
go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, the indictment against the GRE officers will never be proven one way or the other. These guys will never show up in a U.S. court. And I think that makes it a political document, that indictment. And Mueller had to understand, given the way the media was behaving, that they would run with this and never use the word alleged to talk about his indictment, but that it's a fact. You'll read it repeatedly in the biggest newspapers in the country that Russia stole these emails without any it ever going into a courtroom, and it won't. So that brings me to the role of the media in this. You've been really good on this, Aaron. Mueller had to understand what kind of media he was working with, and he can get this into the papers as if it's a proven fact and never have to prove it in court.
Yeah, the level of stenography in Russiagate and the absence of critical thinking, is like nothing we've seen since the Iraq War. And again, Bob Perry, literally, if you go back and read his work at the beginning, because again, I came along kind of late. Like I came along to this issue in like the summer of 2017, but Bob Perry was on this from the beginning. And he repeatedly was pointing out just how farcical and flawed all these stories were. So we all know that, and we all know how awful MSNBC was and how unhinged they were with their insane conspiracy theories. I mean, getting to the point where you had people like Rachel Maddow wondering if Putin was giving Trump orders, and that becoming normalized. That became a normalized facet of our political and media culture. And you can't find enough examples of unhinged, crazy rhetoric becoming mainstream. And one day, somebody, maybe I'll do it, we'll put together a good documentary just of all the craziness that we went through. But what I'm particularly concerned about in this context, speaking to a leftist progressive audience, is the fact that websites like Consortium News, the Gray Zone, for a while when I was there, although I'm not there anymore, at the Real News, we stood out because we were some of the few ones that were not going along with it. But I think a big problem happened where Russiagate became synonymous with being anti-Trump. And so any questioning of Russiagate was then, on the surface taken by some progressives at prominent outlets like The Intercept and Democracy Now! And of course at the Young Turks and some of my colleagues at The Nation. Questioning Russiagate, I think for some people became seen as somehow helping Trump. When of course in reality, I mean, putting aside the fact that we have a duty as journalists to follow the facts, politically, I can't think of a bigger gift to Trump than diverting his resistance into a baseless conspiracy theory, taking attention off of his actual policies, and then once it all collapses, handing him the gift of being vindicated. I mean, I think, I came at this from two angles. As a journalist, just trying to follow in the footsteps of people like Bob Perry, following the facts, even no matter the consequences. And politically, as a progressive, thinking this is a nightmare. I mean, it's distracting from Trump's actual policies. It's venerating intelligence communities. It's putting our faith in Robert Mueller, whose record includes not lying, but coming to Congress and peddling the lies about Iraq having WMDs when he was director of the FBI, rounding up Muslim immigrants after 9/11 and detaining them and subjecting them to harsh conditions, turning anti-Trump resistance into a form of sort of militarist jingoism because it encouraged confrontation and militarism towards Russia, and then conspiracy theory thinking, and paranoia. So this was a disaster for progressive causes, but I think unfortunately there was a lack of thinking on the part of some of our colleagues in progressive media in seeing that, and unfortunately partly because Russiagate incentivized people to play along with it. if you challenged it, you were deemed as, you know, a Putin apologist or a Trump supporter. And if you peddled it, though, if you drank the Kool-Aid and went along with it, then you had benefits. You could get published in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and you could appear on MSNBC and CNN. And so it was an incentivized racket for too many people. And unfortunately, too many people, including some of our colleagues in progressive media, got sucked in.
Well, that answers the next question I was going to ask you, which is how much does this set us back and set the country back in terms of the ability to beat Trump? As you say, the real resistance against Trump, rather than this, you know, kind of fake propaganda narrative pushed to the breaking point in a way that just, as you say, hands him a victory. Do you think that this has almost destroyed the chance of any Democrat, whether progressive or neoliberal, to actually go against Trump, or is it not quite that terrible of an event?
Well, I mean, I hope it's not terrible. I guess we'll see, right? And we'll guess. I think partly that depends on how long Democrats and their partisans and media continue to double down on this. How much more time they want to waste? How much more of a how much deeper do they want to dig their grave? You know, when it comes to Russiagate, you know, it's the problem is they're so delusional that they're behaving like people in denial, refusing to let go of it. And, you know, we're seeing this now with this belief that Robert Mueller in his testimony will somehow, that's going to be the thing that's going to save everything. So it's I'm also interested to see also how much damage it did to progressive voices, because you saw, I mean, Russiagate served so many nefarious purposes. One of its uses was to denigrate and demean progressive voices. So that's why you had Bernie Sanders having to explain away and disavow the fact that allegedly Russian trolls boosted his candidacy, you know, and Jill Stein as well. They were tainted, and Jill Stein was even investigated by the Senate Intelligence Committee for having ties to the Russian government and all that. So there was an obvious effort here to, in the process of making, you know, Russophobic conspiracy theory thinking sort of synonymous with being against Trump, there also was an attempt to sort of, attack elements of the left that challenge militarism and challenge the national security state as being sort of apologists for Trump and for Putin. And we'll see, how much of an impact that might have had on progressive forces and their ability to organize, and, you know, whether Democrats who loathe Bernie Sanders will try to somehow use Russia in some weird way to attack him. You know, if he's not hard enough, if he's not like hawkish enough on Russia, whether they'll try to use that to undermine him. That to me is an interesting political question that I think will play out, you know, as 2020 gets closer.
Just a sorry saga about the state of American politics, this entire Russiagate fiasco. Aaron, I want to thank you very much for joining us today on the first edition of CN Live, and I hope to see you back again soon.
Thank you, Joe. It's great to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron.